Assalamu alaikum. This is episode 16 of the Muhammad Ghailan podcast with yours truly as your host. I really do appreciate you listening, and if you haven't subscribed yet, I invite you to do so. It really does go a long way in helping improve the ranking of this podcast. Also, I would like to invite you to check out and subscribe to my YouTube channel where I regularly upload content there. Speaking of which, if you are viewing this podcast on YouTube, please like this video, comment below, and share it on your social media if you find what you hear beneficial and informative. And please don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Finally, as I would like to expand the scope of my work online and raise its quality, I have to do something I hate doing, which is ask for your financial assistance through Patreon. By making small monthly contributions, you could help me upgrade the recording equipment, pay the hosting fees, and dedicate more time to produce content with higher quality. Just a note that Patreon at the moment is set up for monthly donations. So for those of you who wish to make one-time donations, you can make a single donation and then cancel it after it goes through the first time. The link for my Patreon page is in the description box.
حاشا لجودك أن تقنط عاصيا حاشا لجودك أن تقنط عاصيا الفضل أجزل والمواهب أوسع بالذل قد وافيت بابك عالما أن التدلل عند بابك ينفع أن التدلل عند بابك ينفع.
The 1988 American action film Rambo 3 portrayed fictional events towards the end of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Despite the terrible acting, the movie does serve as an important historical window into American attitudes about Muslims and jihad at the time. At the beginning of it, we follow the field officer with the US Embassy in Thailand, Robert Griggs, and Colonel Sam Trotman as they track down John Rambo, who happens to be living in a village in the Southeast Asian country where he was attempting to put his life of combat behind. They show him photos of tortured civilians, including children in Afghanistan, suffering at the military might of the Soviets. Colonel Trotman uses this as pretext for organizing a covert US mission to supply anti-Soviet rebels in Afghanistan, known as the Mujahideen fighters, with missiles to give them an upper hand in their battles. Although Rambo initially refuses, he does eventually go after learning that Soviet soldiers kidnapped the colonel during the mission. Interspersed between the action scenes are conversations between the characters that shed light on how nearly 30 years since the release of this movie, US public opinion has transformed 180 degrees. In a scene where the arms dealer Musa Ghani takes Rambo across the border from Pakistan to Afghanistan, they take a moment to look at the valley and have the following exchange.
This is Afghanistan. Alexander the Great tried to conquer this country. Then Genghis Khan, then the British. Now Russia. But Afghan people fight hard. They never be defeated. Ancient enemy, make prayer about these people. You wish to hear? Very good. It says, may God deliver us from the venom of the cobra, teeth of the tiger, and the vengeance of the Afghan. You understand what this means?
That you guys don't take any shit.
Yes, something like this.
In another scene, Rambo listens to Mas'ud, the leader of the Mujahideen in the village he camped at, telling him about how this war for them has as much a spiritual significance as it does a material one. He is further told that the Mujahideen will help him rescue the colonel because in doing so, their plight might garner international attention, and they see America as an ally in this for them. It is fascinating to note how positively jihad, resistance of the occupier, and turban-wearing men screaming Allahu Akbar on their horses as they went into battle to save Rambo and Colonel Trotman from the Soviets were portrayed in this film. It was all a symbolism of jihad literally saving America. One of the most captivating scenes is one in which the first interrogation session of Colonel Trotman takes place. His Soviet interrogator, Colonel Zaysin, explains how they fight in Afghanistan because they want disarmament and peace, and asserts that their victory will be realized in due time. Colonel Trotman's response may be one of the most ironic statements made by a character representing America.
If you supplied to me worthy information about more Stinger missiles you are planning to deliver, it could provide a way out of this for us both. After all, in the end, what everyone really wants is peace.
The Kremlin's got a hell of a sense of humor.
Please explain.
You talk peace and disarmament to the world, and here you are wiping out a race of people.
We are wiping out no one.
I think you are too intelligent to believe such absurd propaganda.
Now again, where are the missiles?
I don't know anything about any missiles.
Of course you do. But you do not seem to realize I'm providing a way out for us both.
You expect sympathy? You started this damn war, now you have to deal with it.
And we will. It is just a matter of time before we achieve a complete victory.
You know there won't be a victory. Every day your war machines lose ground to a bunch of poorly armed, poorly equipped freedom fighters. The fact is that you underestimated your competition. If you'd studied your history, you'd know that these people have never given up to anyone. They'd rather die than be slaves to an invading army. You can't defeat people like that. We tried. We already had our Vietnam. Now you're going to have yours.
So, you wish to test me? Good.
The final scene of the movie has Ghani asking Rambo to stay, to which Rambo gives the eerily foretelling response where fiction intersects with real life, maybe next time. As the camera pans out and before the credits roll, a dedication appears in the middle of the screen to the gallant people of Afghanistan. While Rambo 3 may be a fictional movie, the historical context in which it was made and the American attitudes towards Afghanis and jihad were very real. During the 1980s, the US government spent millions of dollars to produce and smuggle through clandestine networks textbooks that encouraged a quote-unquote jihadist outlook. These books were the work of the U.S. Agency for International Development by the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and they served as the Afghani school system's core curriculum. The main focus throughout their pages was fighting. Their concept illustrations included drawings of bullets, guns, and dead Soviet soldiers. For example, to learn basic algebra, students would see, if out of 10 atheists, 5 are killed by one Muslim, 5 would be left. Although this program ended with the collapse of the communist government in Afghanistan, these books can still be found in circulation in some Afghani markets today, where they can be bought to indoctrinate children against America with the same lessons taught to fight Soviets in the 1980s. Life is an ironic, tragic comedy. Regardless, in circulation or not, what is more important to note here is that no amount of money will make books write themselves. Supported by funding from the US government, Muslim Afghani academics and scholars helped write these texts. This was sold to them as necessary support for their legitimate resistance efforts against the Soviets. The idea behind it was that to be properly indoctrinated with the belief in resistance being a religious duty, it must be done at a young age. So, what does Rambo 3, the Soviet-Afghan War, and US commissioned and funded textbooks to indoctrinate a generation of Afghani children 30 years ago have to do with Muslims in America today?
Hello. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. Come on, guys, you can do better than that. Assalamu alaikum. You're not on Southwest Airlines. Feel free to speak Arabic all of this weekend. Nothing will happen to you, I promise. I want to thank Dalia for that very kind introduction. Thank ISFU and, of course, ISLA for hosting this debate, this discussion, coming up with the idea of it, very important subject, which we'll get on to, and asking me to moderate it. As my wife, my kids, my mother, most of my colleagues, all of my childhood friends would agree, I like a good argument. And we're going to have one today. Not an argument per se, but a discussion, a spirited debate, I hope with genuine and cordial disagreement on the subject of CVE, countering violent extremism, CVE. I don't think we need to debate the fact that it's a horrible acronym. It's a kind of, it sounds like a medical illness. It's kind of thing what your doctor telling you have, this stuff when you have CVE. Well, while we agree it's a horrible name, what about the concept, the practice of what it's all about? It's a very, very serious subject. Serious issues at stake. Has the threat of extremism, violent extremism, being blown out of proportion, for example? Is CVE being used unfairly to pick on Muslim communities in the US? Or are Muslim Americans in denial about the need to tackle extremism and to work with government and law enforcement in order to do so?
On September 3rd, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, ISPU or ISPU, hosted a debate at the 2016 Islamic Society of North America Convention. The topic was Debating Countering Violent Extremism, CVE, Engagement with Law Enforcement, Harm or Benefit. The main points raised by Sahar Aziz and Dawood Walid against having American Muslims engage in CVE programs were concerned with the deputizing of Muslims for law enforcement, the securitization of the relationship between the government and Muslim communities where Muslims are treated as suspects first and citizens second, and the diversion of precious resources to CVE programs when they could be funneled to much needed social, economic, and political efforts. In addition, there are grave religious concerns that will not be overcome if imams get involved with CVE programs, which include the violation of trust and privacy between them and their communities, being viewed as quote-unquote sellouts by members of the community, especially by those who may have bought into extremist propaganda, and most dangerously, the audacious involvement of government in interpretations of the Islamic texts and tradition. In support of CVE programs, Kamran Bukhari and Muqtadar Khan were concerned with the restrictive framing of the debate. Although they acknowledged the points against CVE, they maintained that Muslims needed to be pragmatic and realistic. They held that CVE is a very minor yet significant aspect of the US government's counterterrorism budget, which will proceed and develop with or without Muslim involvement. As Khan put it, the government needs a counter-narrative to ISIS, and if we do not provide it, Daniel Pipes will. Both panelists further emphasized the need for Muslim communities to be active in taking any available opportunity to challenge the public perception that Muslims are not actively trying to combat radicalization in our midst. Although they accepted the criticisms against CVE, they saw them as evidence for the need to have Muslims engage in these programs to have their say, as these initiatives are still work in progress. If we do not participate now, they contended, we risk being excluded from the development of policies that will have direct impact on our communities. Listening to the side calling for Muslim engagement in CVE programs, I could not help but think that the points they raised in support for their position were actually undermining it. Khan emphasized the need for Muslims in the US to show in a way that goes beyond issuing verbal condemnations that our communities are against the things that ISIS militants do and stand for, and he saw CVE serving this end as an official action-based, soft confrontation with radicalism and anti-Americanism. Bukhari expressed his belief that since Muslims are living under a climate of Islamophobia, we will not get a seat at the table by pushing back in the way Aziz and Walid were advocating for. On close reflection, these are very revealing positions to take. They are first rooted in fear, and second, but most dangerously, in an implicit acceptance of the general framing of the discourse on Islam and Muslims in America. Despite any claims to the contrary, according to the US Department of State's website, CVE programs are specifically about Muslims and no other group. In remarks offered in February 29, 2016 by the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, Sarah Sewall stated, quote, "Violent extremists are not a new threat. They have raged against civilization as long as we have tried to build it. What is new is how the United States and our partners around the world are pushing them back with a more comprehensive, preventive, and civilian-centered approach we call countering violent extremism, or CVE. How did we come to embrace this new approach? The answer is simple: learning. Learning for more than a decade since the searing experience of 9/11. Following these horrific attacks, the U.S. arrayed a range of counterterrorism tools to keep Americans safe, from airport security and intelligence collection to military operations and security assistance. Yet, as the U.S. targeted Al-Qaeda, its remnants dispersed and adapted. They and other terrorist groups exploited local grievances about insecurity, unemployment, sectarianism, or marginalization to merge with militias, criminal networks, and insurgencies. In doing so, they created affiliates and inspired savage new groups like Boko Haram and the so-called Islamic State or Daesh." End quote. As a side note, it should be highlighted that these remarks blame the rise of militant groups to quote-unquote local grievances and deliberately omit mentioning the U.S. direct's role in creating the very conditions that led to them in the first place. They also speak to a point Bukhari made during the debate, which is that bringing up terrorism exercised by white supremacists is a fallacious equivocation and diversion. Unlike white supremacists, Muslim extremists, he tells us, do not have local interests and instead have world geopolitical aspirations. This is why radicalization in Muslim communities requires specific attention in the form of CVE programs. But this begs the question about what these aspirations are specifically. Ever since 9/11, we have been constantly drowning in a sea of articles, books, and so-called experts called upon by mainstream media to explain the role of religion in violent acts carried out by Muslims. Before ISIS declared their so-called caliphate, we still had room to try and stress the geopolitical factors to this violence. Even after the rise of ISIS, we talk about the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the political vacuums created in Syria and Libya, combined with the history of Sykes-Picot and everything else wrong that has been taking place in that part of the world since World War I. But ISIS did something none of its predecessors have done, which is the explicit and very vivid creation of a narrative supported by a sophisticated use of visuals and social media that entangles Islam with their violence. If 9/11 made Muslims walk on eggshells, ISIS exchanged the eggshells for a bed of hot coal. With our feet to the fire, many of us just want a way out. We might be living in the largest Pavlovian conditioning experiment ever conducted. Trapped in a discourse that perpetuates a perception of a necessary connection between Islam and violence, we try to rationalize our learned conditioning to automatically salivate when the subject of radicalization comes up. It simply does not matter what the research says about radicalization and the nature of religion's role in it. Despite our best attempts to steadfastly assert that ISIS's actions have nothing to do with Islam, due to the barrage of headlines in Western media combined with ISIS's sophisticated propaganda machine, like water drops on a rock over a long time, the assumptions of the dominant discourse eventually penetrated our subconscious, and in an Askian fashion, many Muslims accepted this connection, but with a caveat. Muslims moved from asserting that ISIS has nothing to do with Islam to this is a deviant interpretation that must be refuted. It is worthy to note here that for one to interpret, they must first be versed in the text they are interpreting. But we know from a number of reports that 70% of recruits feeding the ISIS machine barely know the text they claim to be following. Before we refute deviant interpretations, we should recognize that the majority of those we say need refutations are ignorant of what is being negated in the first place. Nevertheless, unable to change the dominant discourse, we changed tactics and accepted we have a problem, but we needed a scapegoat. This is where Wahhabism and Saudi Arabia came in. In a way, this can be seen as a blessing in disguise for many Muslims. The enormous financial resources at the disposal of a minority, coupled with the symbolism of being the caretakers of the two holiest sites in Islam, allowed Saudi Arabia the means to propagate a particular version of the religion that, for better or for worse, at times contrasts with what most Muslims have practiced, and often with judgmental hostility that seems to easily declare its opponents as innovators and heretics. It was only a matter of time before the ill-resourced majority took a swipe back, showing ISIS using Islamic references that mostly come from a Saudi-bred or supported background gave that perfect opportunity to hit two birds with one stone: dissociate mainstream Muslims from ISIS, and direct Islamophobic attention to Saudi Arabia and Wahhabism, which by extension also implicated Salafism, given how it is often mentioned in the same breath with them. Regardless of what one's opinion is of Wahhabism, its history, and Saudi's influence on Islam and mosques in the West, or what Ibn Taymiyyah has to do with all of this, it is interesting to note that in the public discourse, these were never linked to radicalization and violent extremism in the not too distant past in the way that they are today. There is a simple reason for that. As we are exposed to it, radicalization is a term used in a political context, but under a veneer of it being a religious one. As we have accepted it as a religious problem, we now find ourselves in a precarious position where not only are we debating CVE, but even the limits that define Islam have become blurred. After seeing how ISIS goes about and justifies its violence towards Muslims, many of us in the West are becoming increasingly sensitive to discussions about what makes a Muslim, in fact, a Muslim. To assert that there are certain basic tenets of belief one must uphold in order for he or she to be within the already very broad folds of Islam is at best politically incorrect, and at worst can smear one's reputation as intolerant, bigoted, extremist, and even, wait for it, takfiri, an excommunicator of Muslims. Furthermore, in the name of tolerance and coexistence, we are witnessing a rise in the questioning of rulings that from an Islamic perspective have always been considered known from the religion by necessity. CVE is not just about deputizing Muslims for law enforcement. It is an outcome of the wholesale enlistment and manipulation of Islam to serve the goals of the American empire. It is about a greater effort to reshape Islam as a religion so it is rendered deaf, mute, and blind after it had previously been packaged for Afghanistan in a way that focused on its armed resistance aspect. It is about how we as Muslims think of our own agency, our religion, and our role in the world. Instead of being independent witnesses upon the people as we are called to be in the Quran, which means there will be times when we have to stand up and call people to doing good and declare when we believe they are committing evil, we are rationalizing how we can theologically castrate ourselves and pass through this part of our journey to God unnoticed. We have submitted our understanding of Islam to governments and now believe we are being true to its teachings because we recognize the concepts and Islamic terms being used. This is the result of making Islam subservient to political goals. The oppressor will always try to pacify the oppressed by stipulating what forms of protest and resistance are acceptable. It is absolutely astonishing that it could be said during the ISPU debate that we must engage in government-sponsored CVE programs because the US government needs a counter-narrative to ISIS and the current climate of Islamophobia, we cannot afford to be seen as dissidents. While we can acknowledge their genuine concern and good intentions, what seems to have escaped those advocating for Muslims engaging in these government programs is that such rationalizations make it clear that CVE is in reality a westernized version of what is known in the Islamic tradition as ulama al-sultan, scholars of the government. This was also the case with the US government-sponsored Afghani textbooks teaching 30 years ago the diametric opposite of what CVE aims for today. In short, Our religious will is subject to the whims of politicians. And to put it bluntly, many of us have accepted a relationship with the US government in which when we are told to theologically jump, we ask, how high? In his article, Muslim Intellectuals and America's Imperial Project, Dr. Hatem Bazayan aptly described this relationship. The intellectual class in general, and the Muslim part of it in particular, has been reduced to a series of engagements initiated by government needs and set in motion according to a predetermined agenda. Rather than being independent, creative, and reflective, the intellectual class, with some exception, has accepted its role as problem solvers for persistent US imperial problems that emerge out of intervention abroad, militarism, racism, and obscene capitalism. American Muslim intellectuals are joining the bandwagon and fitting in perfectly as functionaries of this massive and persistent domestic and global imperial enterprise. The rationalizations for pragmatism and realism in support for engaging in CVE programs are rooted in a false sense that moving from the field to the house equates to arriving to the promised land. But a field slave and a house slave are still slaves. We cannot let a climate of Islamophobia and negative media scare us into literally giving up equal rights guaranteed under the rule of law. We also should not be fooled by euphemistic titles into willingly participating in our own persecution. Jon Stewart's farewell advice in his final episode as host of the satirical political comedy show The Daily Show comes to mind.
But then there's the more pernicious bullshit, your premeditated institutional bullshit designed to obscure and distract. Designed by whom? The bullshitocracy. Comes in three basic flavors. One, making bad things sound like good things. Organic, all-natural cupcakes. Because factory-made sugar oatmeal balls doesn't sell. Patriot Act. Because are you scared enough to let me look at all your phone records? Act doesn't sell. So whenever something's been titled Freedom, Family, Fairness, Health, America, take a good long sniff. Chances are it's been manufactured in a facility that may contain traces of bullshit.
Whenever something's been titled Freedom, Family, Fairness, Health, America, or in our case, CVE, take a good long sniff. Chances are it's been manufactured in a facility, may contain traces of BS. We cannot be so naive as to believe that by engaging in these government programs, we can positively influence the development of policies that will impact our communities. We should instead be challenging any attempt to develop security programs designed with Islam and Muslims in mind. The very nature of these initiatives and their goals necessarily begin with an assumption that Muslims are a people on edge because our religion is a schizophrenic one and anything coming out of CVE programs will be like prescriptions of risperidone, clozapine, or olanzapine. Make sure you talk to your imam about potential side effects to know which treatment is right for you. The words of Ghani to describe Rambo may in fact be applied to us. God must love crazy people. He makes so many of them. Engaging in CVE programs is playing by the rules of the oppressor. A seat at a table that serves a 3-course meal, starting with isolation, followed by emasculation, before finally getting a dessert plate of subjugation, is not something to aspire towards. The oppressor does not maintain power by asking permission from the oppressed, and the oppressed will not be free by avoiding confrontation. Instead of asking for a seat at the table, we should have the backbone to declare that the table is crooked, the food is terrible, and demand that the manager and chef fix it because we are equal stake owners in this restaurant and will not go anywhere else to eat. Thanks again for listening. As always, please rate and review this podcast on iTunes and share it on your social media. For those of you on YouTube, please like, comment below, share the video, and don't forget to subscribe. And a final reminder that if you find benefit in this work and would like to give your financial support, please visit my Patreon page where you can do so. All these platforms and how far and wide uploads go are really dependent on you doing these small things to show your support. Until next time, please keep me in your prayers and take care.
العظيم وأشرف